Welcome everyone to Zoom into Books this afternoon. We're going to be talking with Donald Fraser. He's here to talk about his new book, The Growth and Collapse of One American Nation. So take it away, Don.
Good morning, Kathy. Thank you. First, before I get started, I wanted to thank the Next Generation Indie Book Awards for recognizing my book. It was named a finalist in history, and so I really appreciate that support as well. Let me tell the audience a little bit about myself. I've had a lifelong interest in history and government and politics, and always enjoyed writing. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. To give you some idea, thought about being a journalist, but instead I ended up at UCLA, where I took a political science degree and then got a master's degree from Cal State Long Beach in public policy and administration, and spent most of my career in city governments, either as a staff member in the city management profession, which was about a third of my career, and then 2/3 of my career as an outside consultant to city governments, and have run my own business for 20 years. And now, as I begin to approach my mid-60s, I was looking for a new challenge in life. And so I decided I was going to write a very short book about the American Constitution, and it was going to be like 60 to 80 pages, just a little pamphlet. And the result was my first book, The Emergence of One American Nation, which is anything but 80 pages. And that book kind of goes from colonial era up until ratification of the American Constitution. And what I was interested in with that book was this question of nationhood and what makes America one nation. And so that's sort of what the book, it's the storyline of the book and the struggles that our founding generation had in knitting these 13 disparate colonies together, 13 disparate states together into one nation. And so the logical sort of next step after writing this book about the Constitution was to look at, well, what happened after that? And so my second book, and what we're talking about today, the Growth and Collapse of One American Nation, then takes the story from the 1790s after ratification of the Constitution, and then covers the entire history up until 1861, when the country splits apart with the Civil War. And so, you know, this idea of growth and then collapse, the title, as it indicates, sort of looks at what was it that bound us together as a nation during these early years, and then what were the things that ended up ultimately causing the secession of the southern states of the Union, and then the American Civil War. So that gives you kind of a broad picture of all of that. So. I'm going to share my screen here, and Kathy and I had a chance to talk in the last few days, and we've sort of come up with some questions that I think give you a thread of how this book lays out, and little snippets of it to help you get an idea of how the book flows. And I wanted to start with this idea of a timeline. This actually came from a review that I had of the book. I had sent out an early review copy and gotten reviews, and someone said it's a complicated book. He liked it, but he thought it would be helpful to have a timeline. And I thought, well, that's a really good idea. And so it was sort of after I wrote the book that I came up with the timeline, just to give you an idea how this went. But I really like this timeline because it sort of puts everything down on one page. That was my challenge, was to try to figure out how to do this. And I thought it would also help the classes that I teach. I teach both at UC Davis and Sierra College here in California through the Osher Lifelong Learning Center. I thought it would help them as well to understand sort of the themes, the big themes of the book. So I'm just going to touch on this a little bit and then we can move on. But on the far left with the picture of Washington is this growth period that I define as being basically from 1790 to 1819. And really this period is a time of great disagreement and argument among the founders about what this nation is going to be all about. But they also begin to establish many of the building blocks of nationhood. And I would say none more important than the idea that this was going to be a democratic republic. And that is finally sort of settled, that issue, in the election of 1800 and 1801, when Thomas Jefferson gets elected president and takes over from John Adams. And we have our first peaceful transfer of power in the United States. The founders also left some unsolved business for the future, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, but both federalism and slavery were part of that. And then the book then goes into the period, what I call the Age of Jackson, from 1820 to 1846. And we begin to see the market economy is really beginning to develop. Capitalism is beginning to set in. And they continue their arguments that had begun in the founding era about the type of nation we should be. And we also see the slavery issue begin to pop its head up again as a very active abolitionist movement begins to take place. And then finally, in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, we see this collapse period set in from 1847 to 1861, the period I call the rise of Abraham Lincoln. And we see the North and the South begin to split off from each other during this period. And Lincoln begins to come into power with the rise of the Republican Party as well. So that kind of gives you, Kathy, the big picture of how this all works, and for the people that are listening, of how the book sort of lays itself out. Now, I know you had a few questions for me, so maybe we can talk about those.
Okay. I noticed that in your books, you have an underlying theme of who can be an American. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, that's a really important issue. If the first book was about how did we become a nation, the second book is about, well, who's a part of that nation? And so there's really, in American history, there's been two sort of points of view about what makes America a nation. The first is that we're just like every other nation on the face of the earth. We're made up of a distinct group of people from a distinct ethnic or racial group, what historians call for shorthand ethno-nationalism, this idea that it's tied to ethnicity or race, and that's what makes you part of the nation. And that was certainly present at the founding. It's still present today. We still struggle with this issue. But the other one is that America is unique in that America is an idea. It's not just about distinct ethnic or racial group. It's about ideas, and the most important of those ideas are those that are found in the American Declaration of Independence, written by Jefferson. And a man named Gunnar Myrdal called this the American Creed. And he said, Americans are tied together by the ideals of the essential dignity and equality of all human beings, of inalienable rights to freedom, justice, and opportunity. And of course, Myrdal was talking about, at this point, the Declaration of Independence, and particularly the first 55 words of that that Jefferson wrote, that established this idea of what America is supposed to be about, with liberty and equality and self-government and justice being at the center of what it is to be an American. And America was, at the time that Jefferson wrote this, it was still largely focused on this ethno-nationalism point of view, but there was also, even at that point, great diversity in the country. 20% of the people in the new nation were slaves, of African-American slaves. There were large pockets of Germans in Pennsylvania, Dutch in New York. So you have this nation, even then, that was made up of sort of multi-ethnic, multicultural groups, even back at the founding. And these two ideas are in tension throughout the book, and they're in tension now in our society with things like Black Lives Matter and all the issues that surround that, that make this, you know, still part of our sort of our national story. And the idea of America as an idea, this American creed, this is something that people have struggled with since our founding, to be counted as part of the fabric of America. I write early in the book, I'm just going to read you a little section of it. The universal ideas expressed in the Declaration of Independence and memorialized in the law through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights have not always been achieved. Certainly not at the time they were written, and not today as we continue with the struggle to meet them, nor are they self-actualizing. One way to view American history is as a struggle by individuals and groups to claim their share of these rights, from the abolition of slavery to the women's movement to gain the vote and a share of equal rights, to today's clash over gay and transgender rights. And if I were writing this today, I would say the continuing struggle for Black people to fit into this nation, as so revealed by the Black Lives Matter movement, which has just taken off after the death of George Floyd. So that gives you kind of a big picture about that, and there's much more about this in the book as well. So,
for those who have joined us late on Facebook, we're talking with award-winning author Don Fraser about American history. Don, what are your thoughts about the cancel culture that's going on right now?
Well, that's a very interesting question here. I'm going to stop the share screen for just a minute so we can get into a larger picture here. I think we're trying to grasp with our history and to deal with both the good and the bad that make us up as a people, and both are present throughout our history, from the fact that we had people that owned slaves, other people, all the way through the Civil War, to what we did to Native Americans. And all of this is described in great detail in the book as part of our themes. But yet this idea of cancel culture is really problematic to me, because while we should recognize the things that we've gotten wrong in our country and how we haven't lived up to the aspirations that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence, we should too recognize that that our ancestors laid a great foundation for us to try to achieve these things over time. Lincoln would say at one point in the 1850s that the founders believed in equality for all people, but they knew that it didn't exist at the time that they lived, but that when it was at some time in the future, we would reach that point. And so I think it's important to remember that, and to remember our history, and to remember both sides of our history, and to understand that all peoples carry with them prejudices, discrimination, racism to a certain extent. Every culture on the face of the earth has some of that in their background as well. And so I think you always confront the bad and look at it. And I don't think we've done a good enough job of examining all of that, but preserve the good as well and recognize that as well. But don't try to say, okay, we're going to start from ground zero here. As a historian, that just doesn't work. So.
Well, I think that's true. I also know in your new book, you talk about the twin problems left over from the founding era. Can you address that, please?
Yeah, this is another underlying theme that runs throughout the book. And let me share the screen because this is one of the ones you and I had talked about before. So these unsolved problems, federalism is this idea of how much power should be at the state level versus the federal level. The American experience of this is really rooted deeply in our history as of colonialism. When the British came here and began to settle along the eastern seaboard, they established, of course, 13 different colonies, and they were established over a 100-year period, and they were very different from each other. In the north, in New England, you had soils that were less productive. You had people that were working farms but working two jobs as well. You might have someone that was both a farmer and a shoemaker in order to make ends meet. The middle colonies were more commercialized even at that point, with New York and Philadelphia there. And then the South, of course, became an area where tobacco was grown and slaves were used. So very different areas. And the founders had tried, with the adoption and ratification of the Constitution, to sort of pull us together into a closer union, to make us into one nation. But in order to get that Constitution approved, they needed to sort of obscure how much power was going to be at each level of government and let future generations work that sort of situation out. And you will see, if you read the book, that this idea keeps coming up throughout the period from 1790 to 1860. Are we really one nation, or are we just a group of states that are together in a union for certain specific things? And this will become an issue ever more over the issue of slavery, of course, where the South will say it's about states' rights and protecting our rights to have slaves, and the North will take a different tact on all of that. And this becomes an issue early in the Republic when the Pennsylvania Abolition Society submits a petition in 1790 and to abolish slavery. And the Congress would like to ignore this petition, but unfortunately they can't, because Benjamin Franklin has signed it, one of the great founders of our country. And so they have to take up the debate. And this is a period where the North is gradually going through the process of abolishing slavery in the North, starting in the 1780s, because they believe that it's inconsistent with the revolution, with the ideals of the revolution, the ideals of the Declaration of Liberty and Equality for All. How can you believe in liberty and equality and own other people? It's just not, it doesn't work. So the North is abolishing slavery gradually, and the South is looking at it as a necessary evil. People like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, all of them believed slavery was wrong, but that they were trapped in a system that they couldn't get out of. And of course, the Constitution itself had protected slavery most keenly with the 3/5 rule, which allowed slaves to be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation, which allowed the South further representatives in the House of Representatives, but also sort of fed its way into the presidential system through the Electoral College. And so the Southern states end up dominating the presidency during the early period of the United States as well because of this. But yet the founders in the Constitution are ambivalent about this idea of putting slavery in, and they never mention the word slavery in the document. But the only way they can get it ratified, once again, not only obscure federalism, but obscure the whole issue of slavery in order to get the South to agree to ratify the Constitution. So what happens with the Abolitionist Society petition is the Congress takes up this in debate, and what they soon realize is that, as Joseph Ellis, the great historian, has written, the effort to make the revolution truly complete seemed diametrically opposed to remaining a united nation. And so the conclusion of the debate is they basically conclude the federal government is not allowed to interfere with slavery in the southern states. And so this is where we end up with this tension point that will continue and that I describe through the rest of the book. So.
Thank you. That's important information. I just want to thank everybody for joining us on Facebook, and to let you know we're talking here on Zoom into Books with Don Fraser. I noticed that you have used a lot of biography in your work. Can you tell us why?
I really look at this as being people moving through history. And for one thing, the characters, the people are so interesting that it's almost hard to ignore. But then I also think that history or events shaped the people of the time, but the reverse is also true, that the people themselves definitely impact the times that they live in. So let me give you a couple of examples from the book. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, two very interesting historical characters. The historian John Ferling writes of them that they're the twin strands of DNA that exist in the American body politic. I wrote in my first book about these two gentlemen. We live in a nation that is part Jeffersonian and part Hamiltonian. From the aristocratic Jefferson, we cherish liberty, equality, democracy, and the importance of the ability of the average person to fully participate in government. From Hamilton, we get the vision of America's economic future as a capitalist country. And Hamilton also believed in a strong central government, is leading that effort. And these two men both end up in George Washington's cabinet. Jefferson returns from France, where he's been the minister to France, to serve as Secretary of State, the senior cabinet position. And Hamilton has been selected to be the Treasury Secretary. And these two men couldn't be any more different, both in background and also in what they sort of disagree about. And at one point, Jefferson describes the two men as two cocks in a pit, as the way their cabinet meetings would unfold during the Washington administration. And they essentially disagree over everything. For Jefferson, he wants the country to stay primarily rural and farming. He fears that industrialization of the country will lead to ever greater inequality, which is what he's seen in Europe as he's spent time there. And of course, Hamilton wants the country to industrialize and wants to use the power of government to advance that as well. And so they disagree, and they essentially disagree, especially over the use of government, of active government. This is something you have to get used to as a historian and as a person who reads history. Jefferson's the liberal, but wants small, inactive government. Hamilton's the conservative, and he wants active government. And this position will flip over time to where the liberals are today, the active government group, and the conservatives want very limited government. One other pair to look at in terms of this, because they sort of flow from the Hamilton-Jefferson rivalry, is to Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay. Jackson, of course, is the military man. He's won a great victory in the War of 1812 over the British in New Orleans, defending the city. He makes a national reputation off of this, runs for election in 1824 against John Quincy Adams. He wins the most popular votes. He wins the electoral votes, but he lacks the majority in the Electoral College. Henry Clay was also running. There were 4 men in that election. And the election ends up in the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay is serving in the House as the Speaker, a very powerful position that he's made. And Clay throws his support to Adams, and Adams becomes president by Clay taking his supporters in the House and getting them to vote for Adams. Adams becomes president. And Jackson looks at this and calls it the corrupt bargain, because then shortly thereafter, Adams needs Clay as Secretary of State, which is the sort of the path to get to the presidency in those days. And once again, you have 2 men that are sort of disagreeing over the issue of active government. On the one side, Jackson, who supports the common man in politics and is on the liberal side, wants a smaller, less active government. And Henry Clay has what he calls his American system, where he wants to use tariffs and a national bank, and then install what they called internal improvements, what we would call today infrastructure, to knit the nation together. And these 2 will disagree over all of that. And Clay will ultimately start the Whig Party during the age of Jackson, and to oppose the policies of Andrew Jackson as well. So that's part of why I get so interested in the personalities. And you can see how these impact the period that we're talking about as well.
So you touched on the idea of decay during the age of Jackson. Would you like to discuss that more?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. When I did the timeline for this, I called the age of Jackson the decay period. And I was looking for this perfect word that would describe a period where on its surface, everything looks good. The country is growing, it's moving forward, it's expanding its boundaries westward. But just under the surface, there's a decay starting to set in. And I thought about it as an analogy to a tooth, that when you have a toothache, you don't initially feel it, even though there are problems starting to develop in the tooth. And that's what I was thinking about as I came up with the word. And I remember listing a whole bunch of different words and talking to my wife, Patty, about it, who has a background as an English major and really good with words. And we kept going, no, that word's not right, and that word's not right. And one of us came up with decay. I can't remember which of it was. It was probably her. And we both said, that's it. I think that's that kind of description. And what's going on during the age of Jackson is that both Jackson and his Democratic Party and Clay and his Whig Party are trying to keep slavery off of the agenda. And they're being confronted with it by the abolitionist movement that has really begun to take off in the 30s, led by men like William Lloyd Garrison and Stephen Douglas, or Frederick Douglass, excuse me, who are pushing the issue onto the national agenda. The abolitionist movement will soon split into two parts. The abolitionists are the group that wants an immediate end to slavery in the United States and no compensation for slave owners. And a political movement will sort of branch off out of that, known as the anti-slavery movement, whose goal is to stop the spread and expansion of slavery any further from where it already exists in the United States in the 1830s. And basically to expand essentially the Missouri Compromise line. You can see that in this map here. This was the line that had been established in 1820. Any states above it would be free. Any states below it could have slaves. And this all comes to a head during the Mexican-American War when a man named Wilmot puts together a proviso to a funding bill for the war. And he says that there'll be no slavery in this area out here along the map. There'll be no slavery in any of this area that's taken during the Mexican-American War. And that now will begin to lead to this period of collapse as the South is irate over being closed off from having slavery in any of these areas that are below the Missouri Compromise line, which in essence would have meant that California would have been split into two states, a southern portion where slavery would have been allowed and a northern portion where it wasn't. And so this starts to bring that whole issue to a head, and that's part of this decay issue. So,
in California, we were just talking earlier about the fact that in many instances there does seem to be two states, Northern California and Southern California, to this day.
True, and there are even proposals today to break the state into 3 different states, one at the very north, which wouldn't include San Francisco or Sacramento, and then sort of a middle part, and then a Southern California part. California is almost like a nation state unto itself, for sure. So
it is. It's larger than some countries. Getting back to your book, I've got a question here about the your idea of moral leadership and how it relates to Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. One of the things historians write about Lincoln is how he changes and grows over time. And I was trying to think of a good way to sort of describe this. And, you know, picture's worth 1,000 words. So here's on the left is Lincoln as a young man. And here's Lincoln during the Civil War. And what a difference in this man from the burden of the Civil War and all of the deaths that are going on and all of that, and how much of a toll it takes on him. So this idea of change, I think, can be seen just right in his own face and what's going on. But to put a little more meat on these bones, if you will, this idea of a moral leader, I like the definition that historian James McGregor Burns used in his book on leadership. And he says that moral leaders are guided by near universal ethical principles of justice, such as equality of human rights and respect for individual dignity, and that the leader operates at need and value levels that are higher than those of their potential followers, but not so much higher that they lose contact with them. In other words, you're not much of a leader if you have nobody following you. And we see in Lincoln both sides of this equation. He's trying to reach a greater moral sense about the country and about slavery, but at the same time, he recognizes that he can't get so out in front of his followers that they'll abandon him and he won't have any followers left. And so let me stop the screen share here and just give you a few more ideas about this, of Lincoln and this idea of growth and moral leadership. On the one side, Lincoln thinks that Black people are inferior to white people. He believes that for most of his life. He would often tell racist jokes and all. He didn't think the two races could live peacefully together. For a good part of his life, he supported the idea of colonization, that if Black people were freed, they would have to leave the United States and go somewhere else. But he also was always in his life anti-slavery. He never supported slavery. And in the 1850s, he really begins to develop this idea of slavery as what he called a monster injustice. And in 1854, he gives a speech and he talks about how all people are inheritors of the Declaration of Independence, including Black people. But yet he also continued to maintain his position that he wasn't out for social and political equality for Black people in the 1850s. And of course, he ultimately will get elected president for the Republican Party in 1860 on a basically his position is that slavery should not be expanded any further than it already exists, sort of following the Wilmot Proviso. And then the South secedes from the Union. And Lincoln, once again, initially sees the war not as being about eliminating slavery, but about preserving the Union. And at one point in 1862, he meets with a group of Black leaders in the White House, and he essentially blames them for the Civil War, that the Americans are fighting a civil war over them. And then meanwhile, sitting in his desk is a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. So here we see both sides of him dealing with this issue of what to do with slavery and how to deal with Black people as well. And of course, the Emancipation Proclamation was more of a military solution than anything else when he first issues it, because Black people, as the Union Army went through the South, Black people were streaming to the Union Army. And so Lincoln has decided, well, we should use them as a labor force. We should free them in the areas where we're occupying, but he doesn't free them in the border states, which are still in the Union. And ultimately they will be armed and added to the Union troops as well. But we see this growth continuing. When he gets to Gettysburg to dedicate the battlefield, now the war has been transformed in his mind from just a war to preserve the Union, but now to give a new birth of liberty and freedom to the country, where he gives those famous words at the Gettysburg Address, tying the founding of the nation to the Declaration of Independence, and basically seeing the war as being transformed as well. So we see all these sides of Lincoln. He is in some ways one of the most interesting historical characters. And so I developed those themes in the book as well. So
I know that all of us, most historians, can talk about Lincoln for days. I mean, his reputation, goes far and wide for the wonderful things that he did. I was reading one of your reviews, and it talked about some anecdotes that you have throughout your book. And I know one of the hard things about bringing history to life is understanding the personalities of people in our history. And it says that you have some anecdotes about William Garrison's contribution to the abolitionist movement. and about Solomon Northrup's experiences. And if you speak to that, I think maybe a lot of us are not familiar with that.
Sure. So William Jennings Bryant is William Lloyd Garrison, excuse me, is a very interesting character. He starts out, as many in the abolitionist movement did, in a movement, a Christian movement, to abolish alcohol in the United States, if you can believe it. But he soon learns about the problems of slavery, and he gives a speech on July 4th where he basically begins to come out in support of the immediate abolition of slavery in the United States. He goes on to write a newspaper known as The Liberator, which he will write until the end of the Civil War, calling for the abolition of slavery. He meets Frederick Douglass at one point, I believe it was on Martha's Vineyard, when Douglass, who was an escaped slave from the South, had gone to a meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society and got up at one of the meetings and spoke so eloquently that Garrison grabbed onto him, and the two of them, Douglass started writing for The Liberator as well. And they would eventually split from each other because Garrison didn't think that politics should be used to advance the anti-slavery cause. He was an outsider and just wanted it to remain as an outside agitating movement as well. And Douglass would decide that politics was the only way to be able to make change. And so he would push for political solutions to the problem of slavery as well. And then you asked me about one other person. Who was that again?
Solomon Northup.
Solomon Northup is interesting because he was a free Black man who had gone to the South on business and was captured as being an escaped slave, and was then placed into slavery. And this is famously in the movie 12 Years a Slave that he has talked about his life and experience, and he finally escapes and gets out. But the Fugitive Slave Act required that any slaves that were escaped from the South, that the North was supposed to return them. And most northern states had what they called liberty laws that forbade that from happening, but it was in the Constitution. And during the debate in 1850 about how to solve the problem over slavery expansion in the West from the land that was gained in the Mexican-American War, one of the compromises was to strengthen this fugitive slave provision of the Constitution and require the northern states to repeal their liberty laws. And a lot of men got caught up in this process. And the slave catchers, they didn't really care if they were getting the right person or not, just as long as they got someone that they could take back to the slave owner and give them this person back, then they would get paid. So their interest was in grabbing anyone basically that they could. So.
Thank you. For those of us who have joined us on Facebook, we're talking with Don Fraser. He is a history professor, American history, and he has 2 books. And Don, would you like to tell people where they can get their books?
Absolutely. So the books are available on Amazon, and the Barnes & Noble website also has the books available as well. So they're in some local bookstores around here, but with COVID, it's very hard to go shopping for books. So those would be the 2 primary sites. If you Google my name or put the titles in, you'll find them. There are reviews out there if you're interested in reading the reviews and get an idea of how the books flow. I feel very grateful that I've gotten some really nice compliments about the ease with which the books are written, how easy they are to read and follow. So I hope some or all of you will order them and pick one up. And if we ever run into each other, I'd be glad to sign it for you as well. So.
Well, that's great. I also noticed looking on your website, which is perspectiveshistory.com, these links are also in the Facebook comments, is that you have a history blog. It's fascinating. Would you please tell the listeners about that?
Yeah, so thanks for that, Kathy. And yes, there's a history blog there. It's got information about the books on it. It's got some articles that I've written and posted on the site as well. I haven't done this yet, but I'm planning on doing it, of setting up a set of links to articles. I also write for something called the History News Network that some of you may want to check out. Many historians follow this and read it and submit articles, and I've had a number of articles published on that site over the last 4 years that deal with the themes that are in both of the books and other matters as well that have come up. So yes, I hope you check it out, or check out the History News Network, or you can, once again, just Google my name with articles and you'll see other links to articles that I've written. So.
Thank you, Dawn. We don't have any more questions right now. You have covered a tremendous number of years in a very short period of time here. I want to thank you so much for coming on to Zoom into Books, and I hope you'll come back.
I'd love to. Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate it. Thank you to Headline Books for having me and hosting me on this event. It's been my pleasure to be a part of it. And having the chance to meet you in the last few days and talk about some of this stuff as well has been really a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed today as well. So thank you so much.